Good morning, guys. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about lumber prices today. It's been an interesting few weeks for lumber, a few months actually. If you have followed our channel, you'll know that I've been building a barn, so it's been frustrating to me, extremely frustrating, especially after going for a month or two without having to place a lumber order and then placing some lumber orders and realizing how much more expensive it is to get lumber to finish this project. When I started this project last March, end of March, early April, lumber prices were so cheap at the time. I was considering buying one of those shed kits, but when I priced it all out and I looked at the costs of lumber and designed my own building, I decided that I was going to build my own building because I could build a bigger, better building for the cost of the materials of the shed kit. But man, have things changed. I can't even get lumber for the prices that I can't even get some cuts of lumber that I wanted to use. We're going to build wings onto the side of this building, for example. And I was going to use 2x6s as ledger boards for those wings, but then I decided that 2x6s wouldn't be enough because I'm either going to have to run 2x8 rafters or 2x6 rafters. And by the time I actually attach those boards to the roof, you're going to need, if it's 2x6s, you're going to need at least a 2x8. If they're 2x8s, you're going to need at least a 2x10. So I went to the lumber yard yesterday to get 2x10s. They didn't have 2x10s. They didn't have 2x8s. They had 2x6s and 2x12s. So I kid you not, my ledger boards for the sides coming out are going to be 2x12s. I was concerned about the 2x12s from a pricing point, but then after talking to the lumber yard and just looking at the prices of lumber, I decided it would be a lot cheaper for me to just go ahead and buy the 2x12s and install them than try and wait for 2x10s to come back onto the lot, because it's just not going to happen anytime soon. So I've been following this lumber pricing pretty closely. It's been frustrating, but I have been doing a lot of research on it to understand what's going on. What I find interesting is that I put a survey out on our channel the other day asking what could be causing these prices to go up. And over 50%, nearly 60% of the people who took the survey said sabotage. Since the 80s, the timber industry has constantly been attacked by what they consider eco-terrorists. And these are people who drive spikes in the trees, do all sorts of things to disrupt the timber industry. And we still see that today. In fact, there was some spike driving issues in Australia just last year where environmentalists were driving spikes into trees to try and disrupt the timber industry down there. But I did do some research. I did some research now for timber prices. I did research on everything from coronavirus to possibilities of sabotage, to the Canada, U.S. trade agreements, to China, and I'm going to go through some of these things. The actual reason for the timber increase is something that very few people actually guessed, but the largest reason for the current timber price increases may actually surprise you. So when it comes to sabotage, I'm gonna read off some things for you. Gibson Lumber Mill, Gretna, Virginia, August 10th, 2020. Vermont Lumber Mill, Mill River Lumber, March 27th, 2020. Oak Sawmill, Haywood County, North Carolina, July 15th, 2020. Stone Mills Sawmill, Stone Mills, Ontario, July 2020. Fire deemed suspicious. Then there was the Timberman Lumber Bill, South Carolina, 8 months ago. Collins Products, Klamath Falls, Oregon, January 2020. Fred Netterville Lumber Company, November 2019, Wilkinson County, Mississippi. And there was a lumber mill fire, August 2019, in Mayville, Michigan. Swahomish, Washington Lumber Mill fire, August 2019. There's two lumber mill fires in August of 2019 right next to each other. The Potter Lumber Company in Allegheny, New York caught on fire January 23rd or 22nd, 2020. It's interesting because the Allegheny Wood Products Mill also caught on fire in January of 2020. It was around January 4th. Cosino Forest Products, Henniker, New Hampshire, May 2020. Jefferson, North Carolina, Hunt Lumber, March 2019. Phoenix City Lumber, Alaska, May 2020. Griffin Lumber Sawmill, Cordell, Georgia, May 2020. J, Maine, the Androscoggin Mill, April 2020. Westfield Lumber Yard in Massachusetts, June 2020. Cardwell Lumber Fire, Edna, Missouri, February 2020. Maranichi Lumber in Maranichi, Georgia, October 2019. You guys starting to see a pattern? Adrena Mill, Gap Mills, West Virginia, November 2019. West Fraser Sawmill, Perry, Florida, September 2019. Decatur County, Georgia, private mill fire in March 2020, deemed arson. Conway, South Carolina lumber mill fire, April 2020. Marble, Pennsylvania sawmill, the AWP sawmill fire was in January 2020. So you have a lot of fires in January of 2020 with sawmills. And it almost seems like you get clusters of fires on the East Coast and then clusters of fires on the West Coast, some fires in the middle. I didn't actually put them all together until now as I was reading it off. White City Fire Mill in Southern Oregon Wood Products, August 2019. There were a lot of fires in August 2019. A brand new mill under construction in Alberni, Canada, I believe, Port Alberni Mill, May 2020. It's amazing how many fires there were in May of 2022. Like I said, they come in clusters. Cowlite County, Portland, Oregon, the Swanson Bark and Wood Products Mill, May 2020. Raymondville, an old mill near Houston, Texas that was full of lumber, caught on fire in November of 2019. A lot of fires in 2019, especially in the fall. Pingleton Sawmill fire in Greencastle, Indiana, March 2020. It's a heck of a lot of sawmills that have been catching on fire in the last 12 months. And you know, it's not unusual to see sawmill fires, but to see that many and then them come in clusters, and not just clusters, but geographical areas of clusters, really makes you wonder. And some of those were ruled suspicious, some of them were ruled arson, some of them they blamed on a machine fault or chemical fire or something else that broke it out. But either way you look at it, it's a little suspicious. You can't help but wonder, is there some sort of industry sabotage going on when you see that many fires? If you're not suspicious, open your eyes. But anyway, it would take a little more than, you know, fires on some 30 some odd mills in 12 months. And those are just I stopped researching. I was writing it all down. I hit 31 mills. I just gave up. There were too many fires in a 12-month period to keep up with them all. But we do have a lot of sawmills between the US and Canada. So, so it's kind of hard to look at it and say this is, you know, a direct impact on the price, although it does cause a ripple in the supply chain when you have that much lumber catching on fire. So I forgot to mention also the Union Pacific train derailment in July 29th, 2020. I'm not sure if that derailment was the same one. It happened in the same time frame. There was a train derailment where the guy was trying to run the train into a US Navy ship. But I'm not sure if that was a Union Pacific train or not. The Union Pacific train the Union Pacific train went off a bridge. That was a different incident. But I'm sure the other one probably had lumber on it too. Speaking of the US, one person who commented actually brought this up, which is a good point. The US and Canada have had a trade spat over lumber for quite some time. This goes back into 2015, around that time frame. So to explain this to you better, basically Canada, a lot of their timber industry is partially government owned, heavily subsidized, and so they're able to produce timber a lot cheaper than the US and then, kind of dump it on the market when they have an oversupply. And so the US actually put up to a 25% tariff at one point in time on Canadian timber, which is a pretty high tariff just to cut back on the amount of timber that was being dumped here in the US. I believe that at some point that's been reduced several times. They've kind of eased off of that tariff a little bit, but earlier this year in February, there was a proposal that could come into effect as early as this month in August to lift those tariffs even more, because lumber prices in 2019 were starting to climb, and they were afraid that it would affect the housing development growth here in the United States. So there might be some relief on lumber prices in the U.S. if that were actually causing this situation, which I don't think it is. But that just tells you that even back in February, we were looking at the lumber industry recognizing that there was a shortage coming. And that's not the only reason why there was a shortage coming. I'm going to get to that in a little bit, but that would help relieve some of the strains from a lumber shortage. And so before this pandemic started, these are conversations that industry experts were already having, and really even lawmakers were considering going into 2020. The pandemic definitely heightened the situation, but it didn't actually change anything. You have to look at the realistic facts. I would say that, if anything, the pandemic has affected treated lumber, but we're looking at the price of all lumber. So let's look at this pandemic situation real quick. Number one, you have the federal government dropping interest rates to extraordinarily low levels. And so those who can afford to buy a new home are trying to go out and buy new homes. But the reason why those interest rates are so low is because the housing market is actually pretty soft. We did see a large increase in new home purchases in July of 2020. And I would say that where July was where it should have been if the pandemic never happened. That huge increase in new home sales in July does not offset the earlier months of the year when we saw a dramatic drop. During that dramatic drop at the beginning of the year, new home builders weren't building new homes. They weren't building a lot of spec homes. And so the actual amount of lumber used at the beginning of the year is probably less from the building industry than it was than what it was anticipated. And you're talking about when somebody's building a home, a massive amount of lumber. So the lumber shortage was not caused by the housing market spike from 1% interest rates, but that's not going to help it going forward. The reality is when you drop interest rates to all-time lows and then you, on top of that, give people a bunch of free money, you're going to have a certain amount of inflation. But lumber prices, I would expect that inflation to follow maybe at the beginning of 2021 to really start seeing prices inflate. Food doesn't surprise me, but lumber, I wouldn't expect to really see a big movement in lumber from hyperinflation just yet. I think that move's still coming. The issue that we have with lumber and the pandemic that has also been cited is the amount of treated lumber and home improvement projects. But I can tell you the DIYers are not taking up enough lumber to offset what we lost as far as lumber output from builders at the beginning of the year. And again, if you look at the numbers, while new home sales were high in July, they do not offset where those amounts were at the beginning of the year. We might be looking at a 3% increase in new home sales in 2020. In 2019, we were looking at close to a 7% increase in new home sales. 2018 was a 7% increase. 2019 was still a pretty strong year. So 2020 being at overall 3% is growth, it's expansion. It's nothing to write home about. It's not anything that the timber industry couldn't handle. And all these home improvement projects, like I said, they don't offset all that amount of wood. The only thing that I think the home improvement projects probably offset were treated timber. And again, when you look at treated timber, the treated timber that you buy at big box stores isn't as heavily treated as some of the lumber that commercial users actually use. For example, we buy a lot of our treated posts from a place called General Timber here in North Carolina, and their treatment process is a lot more stringent than the treatment of, a treated post like this. And even the beams that I have this building sitting on that go in the ground, those have a heavier treatment than stuff that you're going to buy at Lowe's. So there's different levels of treatment, and I think that there was a shortage of treated lumber from all these decking projects. There's definitely a shortage on decking boards. Has anybody else noticed that? I built this deck that I'm sitting on, and I paid You know, for an 8-foot board, I was only paying $5 or $6 for an 8-foot board a month ago. And when I went to go buy one more board, I needed a board for a step. It was $9 for that board. I couldn't buy it online. I had to go into the store to get it. They only had a small pile of them when I got there. So there's definitely been a run on treated timber. The supply has probably been impacted in that capacity. But when it comes to timber, it's not like food. You know, you don't have food that is going to restaurants and has to be packaged differently to go to the grocery store. Timber is packaged essentially the same. You could take a shipment of timber that was intended to go to a builder supply to supply home builders and just kind of redirect it over to Lowe's and supply Lowe's. So it's not like food where it's packaged differently and they have to go back and change the way that it was meant to be distributed. A lot of these big box stores and lumber yards and building supply companies can buy from whoever has timber available to them. So while there is some supply chain disruption there, and there's definitely an increase from your everyday consumer versus a home builder, it's not enough to completely offset the home building slump that we had at the beginning of the year. There should have been an oversupply of lumber. This supply issue with lumber occurred before 2020. That is why we had been considering lifting tariffs in August 2020 on Canadian lumber, because we knew that there was a supply shortage coming. Before this year even happened, there was a supply shortage of timber coming. I've also had some commenters talk about the chemicals that are used to treat timber coming from China, and that being a factor. That's not really a factor. I haven't found any articles talking about a shortage in supply of chemical treatments for timber. Instead, what I have actually read was a shortage of timber going to the treatment plants to create the treated timber. So the supply, again, under that scenario still falls under timber. And if you're wondering about China, China does play some sort of a role in this, but not the role that you would think. You see, a lot of people think that because of the Phase 1 trade agreement with China, China is boosting its agricultural purchases and actually would be considered manufactured goods. But that's not the case with China. The Phase 1 trade agreement, this is something a lot of people don't understand. China is buying out of necessity. They're not buying because of the Phase 1 trade agreement. China's imports this year have actually been pretty low. They haven't imported a whole lot, and they've put a ban on a lot of imports. The only thing that China is importing are things that they have to out of necessity, and they're buying it from whoever they can get it from. If you pay attention to U.S.-China relations right now, China has no reason to stick to a Phase 1 trade agreement with Trump. The lumber shortage isn't necessarily China's fault because of the Phase 1 trade agreement and China having to buy more agricultural and manufactured goods from the U.S. But in some ways, the lumber shortage could be blamed on China. You see, in 2019, China shifted its purchasing habits of lumber. See, China is the largest importer of goods in the world. And so when they change their buying habits, it can be very disruptive to other markets. In 2019, China started buying a lot of timber from Eastern Europe. And not just Eastern Europe, but Russia as well. In fact, when it comes to lumber exports, Russia took the place of Canada in 2019. Russia exported more lumber than Canada. There's definitely been a shift in where lumber's coming from. China is a buyer that buys cheap. They like to buy cheap products and they like to build cheap products. China is definitely going to go with the lowest bid when they're trying to get lumber into their market. In 2019, there was an astronomical amount of lumber coming out of Europe and Russia. But why? That's the big question. Why was there so much lumber coming out of Europe and Russia in 2019? What if I told you that the biggest and most significant factor in our lumber shortage had to do with the climate? And I'm not talking about anthropogenic climate change. What I'm actually talking about are periodic cycles of our planet that have caused some disruptions that have actually impacted our global lumber industry. And this is something that some people caught on to in 2019. Well, I'm sure if you're in the lumber industry, you caught on to it because you saw Europe dumping lumber onto the international trade market. And that definitely caused some problems in Canada and the US besides all these mill fires that I just talked about, between 2018 and the beginning of 2019, 30 mills closed down in Canada. That's a lot of mills being closed down in Canada. So what's this big mystery? What's this big thing that's caused the lumber shortage? Because, basically, I mean, you can't just reopen a mill after you shut it down, but we've had to shut down mills in the United States. United States mills cut back on production in 2019 dramatically. Canada was shutting down mills. There was just, a devastating impact to prices in 2019 that caused a lot of North America's processing to shut down. And you can't just turn on a switch and turn the stuff back on again. Once it shuts down, it takes some time to rev the engine back up. Obviously, these companies were in financial pain. That's why they cut back their operations. So to just jump back on the bandwagon and start opening things up is not necessarily a wise decision for those CEOs. So you're not going to see that happen anytime soon. It would be a very gradual thing. You can hit the light switch off, but it takes a little time to turn it back on again. Anyway, so what is this big disruption that happened that caused such devastation to the North American lumber industry and caused lumber in Europe to flood the market? There's a little beetle called the spruce bark beetle. And what happens is this beetle will come out and just devastate a forest. I call it devastation, but environmentally it's actually a good thing. In fact, there are spots in Europe where the beetle's protected from pesticides, because what the beetle does is it takes down, it basically cleans up the forests. It kills weak trees and helps biodegrade them back into our soils and enrich our soils. Obviously, it causes a lot of respiration of CO2 too, because they're bugs that are eating forests. Beetle outbreaks tend to happen in waves. And the reason why they happen in waves is because for this beetle to actually thrive, it needs a weaker tree. When that tree's immune system becomes weak, it allows the beetle to thrive. And as that beetle thrives, it is able to decimate more trees. Something that we saw happen in Europe, and we've actually seen a lot of this beetle problem in Canada. I think they lost 1 million acres worth of trees in Canada due to the beetle. But what happens is in times of drought and fire, and if you look at how many forest fires we had over the past several years, there haven't been as many forest fires this year, but there were in the past several years. So forest fires will affect the tree's immunity. And the other thing that affects trees is drought. So when you go through periods of drought, the trees become weaker. Both of those scenarios create the perfect environment for this beetle to thrive in. And as I said, we've seen a lot of forest fires in Canada and out in Europe and Russia and the Arctic. And then we've also seen a lot of drought. And both of those conditions create the perfect environment for this beetle to just thrive and reproduce. And when the food supply increases for any particular species on this planet, that species tends to thrive. Look at humans. Areas like Norway, East Germany, they've been decimated by this beetle in 2018 and 2019. Now, if you're a lumber company, one of the things that you do is you buy land and you invest in trees. And if your trees are getting decimated by beetles, you're gonna try and save as much of that investment as you can. So what these lumber companies did was they cut down as much of those trees as they possibly could, and they put them on the market. Now, the damaged wood from the beetles does not sell for that much, but China's imports of wood from Europe went from about 20% to 65% in 2019. China was literally just buying up all of this damaged wood because it was cheap lumber, and they can still use it. Even though it's damaged, they can still use it. And so these lumber companies were basically taking down these trees left and right. They were taking down trees to try and prevent the trees from being damaged by the beetles, which caused an oversupply of lumber. And we saw the same thing happening in Russia. Of course, the information that we can get out of Russia is never the same that we can get out of Europe. The transparency is not the same, but I'm guessing that with the amount of lumber that came out of Russia in 2019, there was a similar situation, especially when you look at the environmental characteristics of the areas. And again, Canada also had a beetle problem. Of course, a lot of their damaged lumber they didn't sell, so it didn't flood the market. Instead, they took a loss on the acreage. So that is what I see as being the big problem. Now, like I said, we have to look at why we had so many forest fires and why we had drought conditions. And drought conditions in these areas are so bad. They're so bad that residents could be running out of water within the year. I have good news for you guys on that, but they've been extremely bad. And drought conditions also feed forest fires. So obviously you have a common factor here that is causing all of these things to happen. You had an oversupply of lumber on the market of 2019 that caused a shutdown of a lot of mills in North America, caused a cutback of operations of a lot of mills in the United States. That oversupply of lumber was primarily driven by damaged lumber from beetles and trying to beat the beetles to the lumber in Europe, Eurasia, those areas. And so the beetles were thriving because of the amount of forest fires and the drought in the area. Forest fires are fired by droughts as well. And so now we've got the overall bigger picture of the lumber industry. The thing that has really caused the spike in lumber prices can be narrowed down, and this is a macro scale, can be narrowed down to a climate issue. So what is the climate issue? What caused these droughts? I've looked into several different studies in drought conditions in Europe, and ironically, droughts in Europe can be traced back to sunspot activity. For those of you who follow solar cycles, you know that we kind of peaked out of a grand solar maximum period earlier in the 2000s, and really we kind of exited what would be considered maximum by the 20-teens. And in 2016, from 2015 on, we've appeared to be going into a period of a larger solar minimum. One of the studies I read found, the correlation that they found with sunspots was that droughts tended to follow in Europe a couple years after peaks in high solar activity. And when you look at the modern maxima period, we had a lot of solar activity going up into the early 2000s, and then it's kind of dropped off since then. The last peak of a solar cycle would have been in 2014, 2015. So that, if you follow that out 2 to 3 years based on their study, that would put you in a drought cycle in Europe around 2016, 17, 18. And then you would be exiting that drought cycle around 2020. And so they're basically, from what I have read and understood from that study, using sunspots to determine and forecast drought conditions, after each 11-year, in the 11-year cycle, a couple years after each peak, you're going to start experiencing drought conditions. Now, the reason why you don't have a direct correlation with sunspots, but a following correlation, is because the sun doesn't necessarily create the droughts. The sun creates a different cycle on our planet that, as that cycle changes, creates the droughts. Follow me? So none of this stuff is ever a direct correlation. I think that's what some people who study climate have a hard time following. For whatever reason, it's not hard to believe the CO2 anthropogenic global warming theory, which doesn't correlate either with climate change, but it's hard to compute that cycles tend to take a little bit of time to adjust, and so they don't pay as much attention to the sun. But when you look at the study on sunspots and droughts in Europe, and they ran this study from the early 1900s to present day, there's a very good correlation that shows every 2 to 3 years after a peak in our sunspot cycles, we see some sort of drought conditions in East Europe. So this other cycle that the sun is actually affecting that causes the droughts is the multi-decadal Atlantic oscillation cycle. And that is another very interesting cycle, because if you look at that, when it's hot, it tends to cause drought conditions more up into the Europe area. And when it's cold, those drought conditions tend to shift down into the Sahara. So depending on where that cycle is, it causes drought conditions or damp conditions in other areas of the planet that are affected by the Atlantic. Currently, we've been on a warm cycle in the Atlantic, and I read another study that basically concluded that 70%, so there's not an exact time frame, so within a cycle of that, you have ups and downs, but then you have the multi-decadal cycle has about 20 years of warm periods, 20 years of cold periods. The cycle changes every 20 years. 70% of the time it changes every 20 years. It could be a little shorter, it could be a little longer, but when you look at these overall climate changes, you know, they're looking at a large amount of data, but there is definitely cycle changes on the yearly level, the decadal level, and we've been in a warm period. Under the studies that I've read, the warm period in the North Atlantic should end in 2020. We should be at a peak in 2020 and start cooling. So for the first time in 20 years, we're going to start seeing the Atlantic start to cool. But the fact that we're at a peak in a warm cycle here in 2020 would mean that the drought conditions in Europe would be exacerbated, which would explain, you know, in the Northern Hemisphere where we have a lot of forest fires, we have a lot of drought conditions in certain areas, a lot of that will start to shift after this year. So for those of you in those areas of Europe, Norway, Germany that have experienced severe drought over the last several years, you should start to see some relief from that going forward after this year, based on these studies. I mean, these are all studies. They're using previous data to forecast the future, and while these scientists are incredibly smart, they can't predict the future. They can only tell you what would be probable in the future, and the probability of the Atlantic going into a cooling phase is pretty high. The probability that we're going to start seeing more La Niñas instead of El Niños is pretty high. The other thing, when you get into the multi-decadal cycle, is that it does tend to follow periods of solar activity on the grander scale. So as you look at solar activity back in the 70s was a little bit lower than it was in the 90s and the 2000s. If you look at that multi-decadal Atlantic oscillation, you'll actually see that it was also in a cooler phase. And so all of these things are connected in a very fascinating way. So at the end of the day, when I trace back our lumber supply shortage, because there is definitely a shortage, it wasn't caused by the coronavirus. It wasn't caused by supply chain disruptions. Truckers, at the beginning of this year, the amount of jobs for truckers actually increased. A lot of our lumber between Canada and the US is domestically transported on rail and trucks, and that activity was actually pretty high. The supply chain was not disrupted by the US-Canada tariff situation, although that doesn't help, because obviously it impacted Canada's timber industry pretty dramatically. They were a net exporter of timber to the US. You know, that definitely impacted supply, and like I said, they've talked about lifting some of those tariffs going into August of 2020. Although I haven't read anything recently on it. The articles that I read on that were back in February when we realized we were going to have a supply shortage in 2020. China is not buying more timber, so it's not like all our timber is going off to China. And that, you know, the entire Phase 1 trade agreement with China, I wouldn't pay much attention to that. China has only been buying what it has to buy, what it needs, what it's in short supply of, which is why they're buying so much food. Everybody's been short on food, and if you watch my videos, a lot of that I've related back to changes in our climate. There's not a shortage on treatment chemicals. There's a shortage on the lumber going to the treatment plants. What happened was an oversupply of lumber coming into the market in 2019 that caused a massive cutback on production in North America, and you can't just turn the switch back on. That oversupply that happened in Europe and in Russia came from the spruce bark beetle. The spruce bark beetle was able to thrive because of drought conditions and forest fires that impacted the health of trees. The forest fires and the drought conditions were impacted by oscillation cycles in the Atlantic, which were in fact, or correlate with, solar activity from our sun. So now that we've left this grand maxima period and we've been heading into a decline in solar activity, one of the things that you could actually expect to see is an increase in moisture, which is good, but it's not going to change the lumber cycle right away, because what we'll also see is over time a decrease in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, because as the Atlantic cools, cooler ocean water tends to sink, become a carbon sink, whereas warmer ocean water tends to be a carbon emitter. There are other things that happen to plants. They have a shorter growing season, and so you're not going to have trees growing as fast and as robust in a year. And so you have adverse conditions going into some of these trends, climate trends that we're seeing going forward, that may help make the trees healthier and stronger, may help hold back, drought conditions that are enabling these beetles to thrive. In fact, colder, harsher winters will kill off those beetles. They'll take a dramatic hit to their population. They tend to thrive better when we have milder winters. We have other situations that will occur that will cause trees to grow slower and lumber supply to continue to be hindered. You actually won't see a change. We're used to seeing, the lumber growth that we saw in the 80s and 90s, and we actually won't go back to that type of period of growth in the lumber industry for quite some time if you look at the climate cycles and things like that. There are things that we can do, when it comes to tariffs and when it comes to things like that, to help relieve some of the strain that we have on the lumber industry. But between the fires in Canada and the beetle damage that we saw in Canada and Europe, you also have to consider that there's less timber out there being grown. We've harvested more timber in 2019, and timber doesn't just grow back overnight.
I'm also going to add here real quick that part of this problem with Canada and costs going up, with prices going down from the oversupply of the beetle in Europe, is simply the fact that Canada has had a lot of carbon tax issues. They've had a lot of taxes on stumpage fees, and those costs are making it virtually impossible for these lumber companies to even operate. So part of this is this hyperbole over, the environmental damage from logging, but that isn't necessarily true either.
Living in the state of North Carolina, we do live in a state that's a very large timber state. Agriculture in the state of North Carolina is a $78 billion industry. 90% of the state of North Carolina is covered in agricultural property. 30% of North Carolina, or roughly 9 million acres, is farmland and cropland. 19 million acres, or 60% of the land, is forest land, and most of that forest land, roughly 85%, is privately owned. Forestry is the largest industry in the state of North Carolina. It includes everything from furniture to paper to lumber and Christmas trees. North Carolina is a top producer of Christmas trees, so there's another thing to be thankful for at the holidays, is your Douglas fir Christmas tree. I think I've talked about this on our channel in the past because there's a lot of controversy around timber. We're taking down the trees that are taking all of our CO2 out of the air. And what people don't actually realize is that the timber industry as a whole is a carbon sink. And I did a video a couple years ago, actually last fall, talking about the 2 million trees and Mr. Beast. So in this video, Mr. Beast is planting a tree every 8 feet. If you're trying to grow a forest and you're trying to grow a healthy habitat, something that is going to be healthy for the trees, you don't plant them 8 to 10 feet apart. There were a lot of groups out there that were trying to plant, millions of trees last fall. And I said, guys, don't do this. It's not the right way to plant trees. If you plant trees the way that they were planting them, and I mean, these guys were like flying drones out and trying to drop trees and fields, just a complete waste of energy. And then they were also trying to, plant trees with large crowds of people and, an empty lot somewhere. And they were planting the trees way too close together. And what happens is you make a degenerative forest. And when you make a degenerative forest, it actually has a net positive CO2 emission instead of a net negative.
What happens is that the trees will begin to compete with each other early on. They're going to degrade the soil. They're going to take all the nutrients out of the soil as they try and grow. As they mature, there's not going to be enough airflow between the trees. So funguses will move between the trees more rapidly. Pests will move between the trees more rapidly. Overall, you're planting what we call a defunct forest. Defunct forests emit more CO2 than they take in. 20 million trees doesn't even have an impact on the environment, but planting them incorrectly could have a negative impact on the environment.
The trees aren't healthy, the forest isn't healthy, it doesn't make a healthy ecosystem. This is a problem that I see with a lot of uninformed environmentalists around the world, is that we just go out and do things thinking that we're doing a good thing for the environment, but not realizing that we're actually having a negative impact on the environment. Forestry companies and companies that grow timber actually have very good practices when it comes to planting forests. And they do that because they need the trees to grow healthy, they need the trees to go strong. And so their forests are generally if I went and walked through some of the timber forests around here, the trees are well spaced and they're great habitats for animals. They put a lot of research and energy into how they plant their forests. The other thing is that as these trees grow up, they're being built off of CO2. I mean, they eat this, they basically consume the CO2 from the atmosphere to build and grow their wood. And then when that wood is cut down, and turned into lumber, you gotta think about how long lumber stays in a building for. Our house is over 200 years old. Most of the original framing on the exterior of the house is still there. When we rebuilt it, we stripped it down to the studs, straightened the whole building up because it was all cattywampus, and then we added timber to the original timber. Now, if you've ever dealt with some of that old yellow pine, it's amazing. The old pine, they call it heart of pine. The grains don't look like the grains that you see here. They're super tight. The wood is super hard. It's almost like trying to drive a nail into oak, harder than oak because it's been sitting there drying for 200 years. But that house isn't going to go anywhere. I don't think a hurricane would move it. I don't think a storm would shake it. It's just a solid structure. But we had to add a lot of timber to it to meet current code because the spacing wasn't the same. And so we had to, we actually have, by the time we were done framing it up, I mean, you've got studs much closer than what code requires. It's a solid structure at this point, but all of that wood is going to be there for another 200 years. So that's carbon that's just being held and stored. And that's what the timber industry really does, is they hold and store timber, they grow more forest land. And the forest land, since, timber really took off in North Carolina, the amount of forest land we have now compared to, before the timber industry is insane. We have some of the most beautiful forests, and they're maintained by our timber companies.
In the United States, we have over 40 million Americans a year that apply for hunting and fishing licenses. The sales of guns and ammo to those 40 million Americans have an 11% tax on them that go towards conservation. And all of their hunting and fishing licenses, all of that money goes to land conservation of species. It is the largest conservation program in the world, bringing in over $3 billion a year. But when you look out at this beautiful landscape, that's not the only thing that you're seeing. What you're seeing is a much larger conservation program, one that is a private conservation program, an industrial conservation program. While our logging industry is often seen as the culprit to so many horrible things, sustainable forestry has returned our forests in the state of North Carolina by over 45% since 1974. Today, over 61% of the state of North Carolina are forests.
Timber is actually an environmentally important industry. So that's where the supply shortage is coming from. It's not just one thing, it's a compilation of all of these things adding up. But the biggest contributing factor to the supply shortage in the lumber industry, undisputable, is a change in climate. And that change in climate occurred from the sun.